For over 100 years, Genghis Khan's hordes conquered everything in their path. From China to Europe, no force on earth could stop them. But on one fateful day in 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the unstoppable force met an immovable object. And the world would never be the same again. If you love untold stories of history's greatest battles, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Comment below which empire you think was the most powerful. Now, let's begin. The year was 1206. In the steppes of Mongolia, a man named Temujin had just unified the scattered Mongol tribes under a single banner. He took a new name, Genghis Khan, the Oceanic ruler. And with that title came an ambition unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. For the next 50 years, this one man and his descendants would build the largest continuous land empire in human history. Not through sophisticated diplomacy or trade agreements, but through pure, unyielding military conquest. The Mongol war machine was not just an army, it was a force of nature, a hurricane of warriors that swept across continents. What made the Mongols truly unstoppable was not their numbers alone, though they were formidable. It was their revolutionary tactics. They pioneered cavalry warfare at a scale never before seen. Their composite bows could pierce armor from hundreds of meters away. Their logistics were flawless. They could move entire armies across deserts and mountains with precision. They were ruthless, disciplined, and utterly committed to conquest. By 1260, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the Black Sea. The great Khan ruled from Khanbaliq, his capital in what is now Beijing. His name was Kublai Khan, and he represented the zenith of Mongol power. His armies were invincible. His coffers were overflowing with tribute from conquered lands. His generals were legendary. The world seemed to bow before him. But Kublai Khan harbored one great ambition, to expand his empire even further. To the west lay the Middle East, the Islamic sultanates, wealthy and powerful, yet fragmented. He believed they would fall just as easily as all the others. His generals promised him swift victory. His scouts reported that the Islamic forces were scattered, divided by internal conflict. So in 1260, Kublai Khan dispatched one of his greatest generals, Hulagu Khan, with orders to conquer the Levant and Egypt. Hulagu was a warrior of legendary reputation. He had razed entire cities. He had defeated armies twice his size. He was, by all accounts, the perfect instrument of Mongol conquest. What Kublai Khan did not know was that they were about to face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. Not a disorganized collection of feudal kingdoms. Not a civilization caught off guard. But a highly organized, militarily sophisticated force that had been waiting, watching, and preparing. That force was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, purchased as youths and trained from childhood to be warriors. They were not born into nobility. They were created as warriors. Every Mamluk lived for one purpose, to fight. Their military hierarchy was rigid. Their training was brutal. Their loyalty was absolute. And their leader, Sultan Baibars, was a man who understood one thing better than anyone else: how to defeat the Mongols. Baibars himself was a Mamluk, risen through the ranks through sheer martial prowess. He was a strategist, a tactician, and a warrior. He had studied the Mongol methods. He understood their strengths and, more importantly, he understood their weaknesses. While other leaders trembled at the mention of Mongol hordes, Baibars saw an opportunity. In 1260, as Hulagu's army marched westward, pillaging and conquering as it always had, Baibars made a decision that would change history. He would not flee. He would not negotiate. He would fight. And he would fight on ground of his choosing. He mobilized the Mamluk army. 45,000 warriors, mounted and equipped with the finest weapons Egypt's wealth could produce. They marched north from Cairo, into the land of Canaan, toward a small village in Galilee called Ain Jalut. There, in a narrow valley between the mountains, Baibars prepared a trap that would alter the course of world history forever. To understand why the Mamluks could do what no other civilization could, one must first understand who they were and how they came to power. Their story begins not with conquest, but with slavery and transformation, a unique path to greatness that no empire had taken before. The Mamluk system began centuries earlier in the Islamic world. Unlike European feudalism, where power was inherited through bloodlines, the Islamic sultanates developed a different model. They purchased young slave boys from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and other regions. These children, often no more than 7 or 8 years old, were torn from their families and transported to military academies in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. There, they underwent the most rigorous military training known to medieval civilization. They were taught horseback riding from dawn until noon, under the scorching Egyptian sun. They trained with every weapon available: the scimitar, the lance, the bow, the axe. They studied strategy, military history, and tactics. They learned Arabic, Islam, and the code of honor that defined their brotherhood. But this was not gentle instruction. The training was designed to break them, reshape them, and forge them into something superhuman. A Mamluk boy who could not ride was beaten. A soldier who showed weakness was humiliated. Those who fell behind were cast out or executed. Only the strongest, the most resilient, the most dedicated survived to become full Mamluks. What emerged from this crucible was a warrior unlike anything the medieval world had seen. The Mamluk was not loyal to a kingdom or a tribe. He was loyal to his brothers in arms and to his sultan. He had no family to distract him, no inheritance to covet, no private interests to pursue. His entire existence was devoted to one thing: war. By the 13th century, the Mamluks had become the dominant military force in Egypt and the Levant. They had overthrown their original masters and established their own sultanate. The Mamluk sultan ruled not through hereditary right, but through military merit. The strongest Mamluk commander became sultan. If he grew weak or lost the support of his peers, he was deposed or killed. It was a brutal system, but it ensured that only the most capable leaders held power. In 1250, a Mamluk commander named Baibars rose to prominence. He was born a slave in Central Asia, purchased as a boy, and trained in the military academies of Cairo. Unlike most Mamluks, Baibars possessed something rare: not just military skill, but strategic genius. He understood not just how to win battles, but why battles were won. He studied his enemies obsessively. He learned their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. By 1260, Baibars had become the effective ruler of Egypt, though officially he served as regent to a puppet sultan. His reputation was fearsome. He had already proven himself in countless battles. But his greatest test was about to arrive. The Mongols had already conquered the Eastern Islamic world. They had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, massacring over 1 million people. The Islamic world was reeling, fragmented, leaderless. Many believed the end of Islam itself was at hand. The great powers of the Middle East, Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, had all fallen to Mongol arms. Egypt stood alone. It was the last major Islamic power left standing. And now Hulagu Khan's army was marching toward it, growing larger as it absorbed the armies of conquered territories. By some estimates, Hulagu commanded over 100,000 warriors. Baibars had 45,000. On paper, the numbers suggested an easy Mongol victory. But Baibars saw something others did not. He saw that the Mongol army, vast as it was, moved slowly. It was tied to supply lines, to logistics, to the infrastructure of conquered territories. It was powerful, but it was not infinitely flexible. More importantly, Baibars understood that the Mongols, for all their might, had never faced an enemy like the Mamluks. They had conquered scattered kingdoms, feudal states, and disorganized tribal forces. But the Mamluk army was different. It was professional, disciplined, and trained specifically for the kind of cavalry warfare that the Mongols practiced. Baibars made his decision. He would not retreat. He would not surrender. He would challenge Hulagu Khan on the field of battle. Hulagu Khan was not just any general. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan himself. Born into the imperial family, trained in the art of conquest from birth, Hulagu represented the very peak of Mongol military excellence. His father had conquered vast territories in Persia. His brothers commanded millions. And now, at the height of his power, Hulagu was tasked with the greatest conquest of all, the subjugation of the Islamic world. In 1256, Hulagu had begun his campaign. First came Alamut, the fortress of the Assassins, an Islamic sect that had terrorized the Middle East for centuries. Hulagu's siege was relentless. The fortress fell. The Assassins, who had seemed invincible for so long, were crushed beneath Mongol hooves and arrows. Next came Persia itself. City after city fell before Hulagu's advance. Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, the center of Islamic learning and culture, was next. In 1258, Hulagu's armies surrounded the city. The Caliph, the spiritual leader of Islam, was inside, surrounded by scholars, poets, and religious leaders. The siege lasted 40 days. When the Mongols finally broke through the walls, what followed was one of the greatest massacres in human history. Contemporary accounts suggest that between 200,000 and 1 million people were killed. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from all the manuscripts thrown into its waters. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest repositories of human knowledge, was destroyed. Centuries of scientific and philosophical achievement were reduced to ash. But Hulagu did not stop there. He pressed westward, his army seemingly unstoppable. Damascus fell next. Aleppo surrendered without significant resistance. With each victory, Hulagu's confidence grew. His generals assured him that Egypt would fall within months. The Mamluk army, they said, was no match for Mongol prowess. Hulagu's army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Estimates vary, but conservative historians place his forces at around 100,000 warriors, with perhaps as many more support troops, servants, and logistics personnel. They moved in organized columns, with cavalry scouts far ahead, engineers preparing siege equipment, and supply trains stretching for miles behind the main force. The Mongol army was a marvel of medieval organization. Unlike European armies of the time, which were often chaotic assemblies of feudal levies, the Mongol forces were structured, disciplined, and coordinated. Every soldier knew his place in the hierarchy. Orders flowed from the top down with crystalline clarity. Tactics were executed with mechanical precision. Hulagu himself was an experienced commander. He had inherited his grandfather's strategic brilliance. He understood terrain, he understood logistics, he understood the psychology of conquest. He also understood that speed and psychological warfare were as important as brute force. Towns that surrendered were sometimes spared. Towns that resisted were obliterated. As Hulagu's army marched south from Syria into Palestine, they were essentially unstoppable. They had conquered everywhere else. Why should Egypt be any different? The confidence in Mongol superiority was not arrogance. It was based on a century of unbroken military dominance. No army had seriously challenged Mongol forces in open battle and survived. No siege had withstood Mongol assault. No kingdom had managed to field a force capable of matching Mongol arms, tactics, and discipline. But Hulagu did not know what Baibars knew. He did not understand that he was marching toward a confrontation unlike any his people had ever faced. He did not realize that his enemy had spent months preparing, studying, and planning. He did not know that Baibars had deliberately withdrawn from several positions, not out of weakness, but out of strategic calculation. Most importantly, Hulagu did not know that his army, for all its might, had a critical weakness. One that Baibars had identified. One that Baibars would exploit with devastating effect at a small village called Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut. The name means Spring of Goliath in Arabic. It was not a major city or a fortress of great renown. It was a small agricultural village in the Jezreel Valley, in the land of Canaan, in what is now northern Israel. To the casual observer, it seemed an unremarkable place. Valleys and springs were common in this region. There was nothing obviously strategic about it. But Baibars saw something that others did not. He saw not just a place, but a stage. He saw the possibility of shaping the flow of battle, of controlling the narrative through geography. The valley was narrow, with mountains on either side. Water was available, which was critical for an army on campaign. Most importantly, it was positioned on the route that Hulagu's army would have to follow if they were to continue their advance into Egypt. Baibars arrived at Ain Jalut with his army in early September 1260. His scouts had confirmed that Hulagu's main force was still several days' march to the north. But a significant Mongol contingent, perhaps 20,000 warriors under the command of Hulagu's lieutenant Kitbuka, was advancing rapidly ahead of the main army. Baibars made a critical decision. Rather than wait for the full Mongol force to arrive, he would attack this advance guard. Strike them hard and fast, then withdraw before Hulagu's main army could reinforce them. It was a dangerous gambit. If his timing was off, if he misjudged Mongol movements, he could find his entire army surrounded and destroyed. But Baibars was a student of risk. He had studied the Mongol advance for weeks, perhaps months. His scouts were everywhere. He had detailed knowledge of Mongol movements, supply lines, and communication methods. He knew the probable location of the main army at any given time. He knew the realistic speed at which Hulagu's forces could move. So Baibars positioned his army in the valley with meticulous care. He placed his cavalry in concealed positions on the flanks, hidden by the terrain and the sparse vegetation. He positioned archers on the ridges overlooking the valley floor. He established a reserve force ready to exploit any opening in the Mongol lines. He ensured that water sources were secure and that his supply lines were protected. Most importantly, he established contingencies. If the battle turned against him, he had planned retreat routes. If reinforcements arrived, he had pre-planned positions for additional units. He had thought through dozens of scenarios, preparing for each one. The valley itself became his fortress. Every rock, every ridge, every meter of terrain was factored into his calculations. Where the Mongols saw simply a valley to traverse, Baibars saw a carefully prepared killing ground. By September 3, 1260, everything was in place. Baibars had positioned his army under cover of darkness. His forces were hidden, rested, and ready. The Mongol advance guard, under Kitbuka, was approaching from the north, unaware of the trap that awaited them. For generations, the Mongols had won battles through superior cavalry mobility, through devastating archery at range, and through psychological dominance. They had refined these tactics to a razor's edge. Baibars had studied these tactics, and he had prepared a response. a response that would prove that even the seemingly invincible could be defeated. That even the Mongol war machine had limitations. That even legends could fall. As the Mongol scouts entered the valley at dawn, with the main Mongol force following behind, neither side realized they were about to participate in one of the most consequential battles in human history. A battle that would prove that the Mongol dominance was not eternal. A battle that would reshape the map of the world. September 3rd, 1260. Dawn breaks over the Jezreel Valley. The morning is cool, the sky clear, the air still. In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats. The Mongol advance guard is arriving, perhaps 2,000 cavalry scouts leading a force of approximately 20,000 warriors under Kitbuka's command. To the Mongols, the valley appears empty. Baibars has withdrawn his main army into concealment with disciplined precision. His cavalry is hidden in gullies and behind ridges. His archers are positioned on the heights. His reserve forces are held back, out of sight. To any observer, the valley seems undefended. Kitbuka, the Mongol commander, sees an opportunity. Here is a valley, seemingly empty, perfect for cavalry maneuver. His scouts report no significant enemy presence. The path to Egypt lies open. He can push forward, establish a forward position, and wait for Hulagu's main army to arrive. Speed is a Mongol virtue, and Kitbuka embodies this virtue. He orders his forces forward into the valley. This is the moment Baibars has been waiting for. The Mongols are committed now. They are in the valley, surrounded by terrain that will limit their ability to maneuver and withdraw. And they have no idea that their enemy is waiting. Baibars signals the attack. What follows is a masterclass in tactical excellence. The Mamluk archers on the ridges release their arrows simultaneously. Hundreds of shafts arc through the morning air, descending on the Mongol cavalry like a deadly rain. Mongol warriors cry out as arrows find their marks. Horses scream and stumble. Entire sections of the Mongol line are devastated. The Mongols respond with their own archery, but they are at a disadvantage. They are on the valley floor, looking up at enemies positioned on higher ground. Their arrows lack the range and angle of the Mamluk response. Meanwhile, the Mamluk cavalry emerges from concealment, charging into the Mongol flanks. The battle becomes desperate and close. What had seemed an invincible Mongol advance is suddenly transformed into a struggle for survival. Mongol horses, panicking from the sudden assault, become difficult to control. Mongol formations, designed for open-field cavalry charges, are fragmented and disrupted by the terrain and the sudden enemy presence. But Kitbuka is an experienced commander. He regroups his forces, establishes defensive positions, and organizes a counterattack. The Mongols begin to stabilize their position. Their archers, despite the disadvantage of terrain, begin to take a heavy toll on the Mamluks. Mongol cavalry charges, launched downhill from what little high ground they can establish, begin to inflict casualties on the Mamluk forces. The battle becomes a grinding contest of cavalry versus cavalry, archery versus archery, will versus will. Neither side is winning decisively. Blood stains the valley floor. Bodies pile up. The morning light illuminates a scene of medieval warfare at its most brutal and unforgiving. Then, at a critical moment, Baibars commits his reserve cavalry. Fresh Mamluk warriors, still unwearied, charge into the Mongol formations from a new direction. This hammer blow, striking at the moment when the Mongols are already engaged and depleted, proves decisive. The Mongol lines begin to collapse. Kitbuka attempts to maintain order, to execute a disciplined retreat, but the psychological impact of their first serious defeat is catastrophic. Mongol warriors who have never known defeat, who have grown up believing in their own invincibility, begin to panic. What becomes a rout? The remaining Mongols flee northward, pursued by Mamluk cavalry. Kitbuka himself is killed in the fighting. Thousands of Mongol warriors are cut down as they attempt to escape the valley. By midday, it is over. The Mamluk victory is complete and overwhelming. The Mongol advance guard has been destroyed. The myth of Mongol invincibility has been shattered, and the course of world history has changed forever. But the true significance of this moment has not yet become apparent. For in the north, Hulagu Khan still commands hundreds of thousands of warriors. The main Mongol army is still intact, still powerful, still dangerous. The real confrontation is only just beginning. News of the disaster at Ain Jalut traveled fast. Within hours, messengers on horseback were riding north toward Hulagu Khan's main encampment with the terrible news. The advance guard had been destroyed. Kitbuka was dead. The Mamluks had won a decisive victory, and they were advancing northward to confront the main Mongol army. Hulagu Khan received the news with shock and disbelief. For decades, he had known only victory. His generals had assured him of swift triumph over the Mamluks. His scouts had reported an Egyptian army that was scattered and demoralized. How could this have happened? But even Hulagu, proud and confident though he was, understood the reality of the situation. His advance guard was gone. His supply lines were now vulnerable. Reinforcements from the main Mongol Empire were weeks away. He had expected to be reinforced by Mongol armies from Central Asia, but these forces had not yet arrived. More concerning was news from the Mongol homeland. There had been a dispute over succession following Monk Khan's death. Hulagu's brother Erik Bok was contesting the authority of another brother, Kublai Khan. The Mongol Empire itself was beginning to fracture. This meant that Hulagu could not count on receiving reinforcements or support from the Mongol homeland. Hulagu made a decision that many military leaders would never make. He decided to withdraw, not in disgrace or panic, but in a calculated tactical retreat. He would preserve his army, regroup, and re-establish supply lines. He would not risk his entire force in a pitched battle against an enemy that had just proved itself capable of inflicting serious losses. This decision was a turning point not just in this one campaign, but in the trajectory of world history. Because Hulagu's decision to withdraw meant that Egypt would not fall to Mongol conquest. The Mamluk Sultanate would survive, and in surviving, it would protect the Islamic world from complete Mongol domination. Meanwhile, Baibars pursued the retreating Mongols, ensuring that they did not regroup and attempt another assault. His victory was complete not just in military terms, but in psychological terms. The Mamluks had defeated the Mongols. They had proven that the seemingly invincible could be defeated. This knowledge would spread throughout the Islamic world, throughout Asia, throughout the entire medieval world. The shock was profound. Armies that had feared Mongol conquest now began to reconsider their options. Kingdoms that had been resigned to eventual conquest saw a possibility of resistance. The psychological dominance that had been the Mongols' greatest weapon, the belief that they could not be defeated, had been shattered in a single day's fighting at a small valley in Palestine. For the Mamluk Sultanate, the victory at Ain Jalut transformed Egypt from a desperate, besieged kingdom into a regional superpower. Baibar's reputation became legendary throughout the Islamic world. He had accomplished what seemed impossible. He had defeated the Mongols. Baibars consolidated his power over the following years. He eliminated rivals, strengthened the Mamluk military structure, and established Egypt as the protector of Islam. When Mecca and Medina fell into his sphere of influence, his authority became unquestionable. The Mamluks would rule Egypt and the Levant for over 2 centuries, until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. But the consequences extended far beyond Egypt and the Islamic world. The Mongol Empire, once seemingly destined to conquer the entire world, would never again achieve the level of military dominance it had possessed before Ain Jalut. It would continue to expand in some directions, but it would also encounter increasing resistance from awakened and organized opponents. The battle at Ain Jalut marked the moment when the trajectory of global conquest shifted. It was the first major setback for the Mongol war machine. It proved that tactical genius, preparation, and courage could overcome even the most formidable military advantage. And it proved that the age of Mongol invincibility had ended. In the years following Ain Jalut, Sultan Baibars became a figure of almost legendary status throughout the Islamic world. Where once there had been despair and resignation to inevitable Mongol conquest, now there was hope. A single man, a former slave who had risen through sheer ability and courage, had defeated the supposedly invincible Mongols. Baibars understood the power of narrative. He used his victory to consolidate his authority not just through military means, but through propaganda and strategic alliance building. He presented himself as the savior of Islam, the man who had stood against the Mongol tide when all others had fallen. Over the following years, Baibars modernized the Mamluk military. He recruited the best cavalry warriors from across the Islamic world. He invested in new weapons and tactics. He built fortresses and established an intelligence network that rivaled any contemporary power. He transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a regional power into a superpower that could project influence across the Mediterranean and into Europe. Baibars also understood the importance of controlling the narrative of history. He commissioned chroniclers to record his deeds. He ensured that his victory at Ain Jalut was remembered not merely as a military engagement, but as a civilizational turning point, a moment when the forward march of conquest had been halted. But perhaps most significantly, Baibars understood that his victory had implications far beyond Egypt and the Islamic world. The Mongol Empire, for all its might, had been shown to be defeatable. This knowledge would embolden resistance movements across Asia and Eastern Europe. Kingdoms that might otherwise have submitted now chose to fight. Within a few decades, the Mongol Empire would fragment into competing khanates. The unified, seemingly unstoppable force that had conquered half the known world would dissolve into separate empires competing for power and resources. By the 14th century, Mongol power had substantially declined in many regions. This fragmentation cannot be attributed entirely to Ain Jalut, but the battle was certainly a catalyst. It demonstrated that organized resistance was possible. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. It gave hope to those who might otherwise have surrendered. Baibars himself would live another 19 years after Ain Jalut, until 1279. During those years, he cemented his position as one of the greatest military leaders of the medieval world. He expanded Egyptian influence, he strengthened the Mamluk institution, and he ensured the survival of the Islamic sultanates at a moment when their destruction seemed inevitable. After his death, Baibars became a figure of legend. Stories of his military genius, his courage, and his strategic brilliance were retold throughout the Islamic world. He became a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. Future generations of Islamic warriors would study his tactics and his strategies. Military historians would analyze his decisions at Ain Jalut as a masterclass in tactical excellence. Yet in the Western world, Baibars remained largely unknown. European chroniclers focused on the Crusades and European concerns. They had little awareness of the vast geopolitical struggles playing out in the Middle East and Asia. Consequently, while Baibars became a legendary figure in Islamic history, he remained virtually unknown in Europe. This historical irony would echo through the centuries. The man who had halted the seemingly inevitable conquest of the world by the Mongol Empire remained largely forgotten in the part of the world that the Mongols had never fully conquered. But in the Islamic world, in Asia, and among those who studied medieval military history, Baibar's legacy remained powerful and enduring. He had proven that courage, preparation, and tactical genius could overcome even the most formidable enemy. He had shown that the future was not predetermined, that history could be changed by the choices of individuals and nations. And he had demonstrated that the arc of conquest, even when seemingly irresistible, could be bent toward justice and resistance. The Mongol Empire in 1260, at the moment of the Battle of Ain Jalut, was nominally unified under Kublai Khan. But in reality, the vast empire was already fragmenting into competing power centers. Each Khan controlled his own domain, and while they maintained a facade of loyalty to the great Khan in Khanbaliq, they increasingly pursued independent policies. The defeat at Ain Jalut accelerated this fragmentation process. Hulagu Khan, returning to his domains in Persia and the Levant after his withdrawal from Egypt, found his prestige diminished. He had promised a quick victory over the Mamluks. Instead, he had suffered a defeat. This loss of confidence among his generals and soldiers had consequences. Meanwhile, other Mongol Khans began to reassess their own military strategies. If the Mamluks could defeat a major Mongol force, could other enemies do the same? This question led to a fundamental re-evaluation of Mongol military doctrine and strategy. The period of unquestioned Mongol superiority was ending. In Central Asia and China, different Mongol Khans pursued different policies. Some continued aggressive expansion. Others focused on consolidation of existing territories. Still others engaged in conflicts with each other for control of the Mongol homeland. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire had effectively broken into separate khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. These were nominally connected but practically independent. They sometimes cooperated, sometimes competed, and occasionally fought wars against each other. This fragmentation meant that no single Mongol power had the resources to launch the kind of massive, coordinated conquest campaigns that had characterized the mid-13th century. The Mongols remained formidable military powers in their respective regions, but they no longer posed an existential threat to the civilizations that had feared total conquest by a unified Mongol empire. The defeat at Ain Jalut was not the sole cause of this fragmentation, but it was a significant contributor. It demonstrated that unified Mongol forces could be defeated. It encouraged other potential rivals to resist. And it meant that the Mongol Khans could no longer count on the aura of invincibility that had previously discouraged resistance. For the Islamic world specifically, the failure of Hulagu Khan's campaign meant that the Mamluk Sultanate would survive as a major power. Egypt would not become a Mongol tributary state. The Islamic sultanates of the Levant would not be conquered and absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Instead, a new power structure would emerge in the Islamic world, with the Mamluks as the dominant force. This had profound implications for world history. The Mamluk Sultanate would become the major Mediterranean power for centuries. They would prevent Ottoman expansion for 200 years. They would control crucial trade routes. They would be a major player in the geopolitical struggles of the medieval and early modern Mediterranean. None of this would have happened if Baibars had been defeated at Ain Jalut. If the Mongols had won that battle, the trajectory of world history would have been entirely different. The Mamluk Sultanate would have likely been destroyed. Egypt would have been incorporated into the Mongol Empire. The Islamic world would have been dominated by Mongol successor states. But because Baibars defeated Hulagu's advance guard in that narrow valley, a different future emerged. A future in which the Islamic world retained its independence. A future in which the Mamluks became a great power. A future in which the Mongol Empire remained formidable but not all-conquering. This is the power of individual battles and individual decisions in history. One victory in one valley on one day led to consequences that echoed through centuries. Ain Jalut proved that history was not predetermined, that the outcome of civilizations' conflicts was not determined by abstract historical forces, but by the decisions, courage, and tactical brilliance of specific individuals and armies. Baibars understood this. And this is why he worked so carefully to ensure that his victory was remembered not as a temporary setback for the Mongols, but as a fundamental turning point in world history. Following the victory at Ain Jalut, Baibars moved with remarkable speed to consolidate Mamluk power throughout Egypt and the Levant. He understood that military victory alone was insufficient. He needed to build political structures, establish alliances, and create an administrative system that could sustain Mamluk dominance. First, Baibars took full control of Egypt. The puppet sultan, the figurehead who had nominally ruled while Baibars served as regent, was eliminated. Baibars formally took the title of sultan for himself. No one disputed his authority. He had proven through military victory that he possessed the strength to rule. Next, Baibars moved to consolidate control over the Levantine territories. He appointed loyal Mamluk governors to administer Damascus, Aleppo, and other major cities. He established military garrisons to ensure that no rival power could challenge Mamluk authority. He invested heavily in fortifying key strategic positions. But Baibars also understood that military force alone was insufficient. He invested in infrastructure, in trade, in diplomacy. He rebuilt cities that had been damaged by Mongol invasions. He reopened trade routes that had been disrupted. He established diplomatic relationships with European powers, including Venice and Genoa, who were eager to trade with the Islamic world. Most importantly, Baibars took control of Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam. By establishing Mamluk authority over these sacred cities, Baibars gained moral and religious authority throughout the Islamic world. He became not just a military ruler, but a guardian of Islam itself. He assumed the title of Caliph Protector, positioning himself as the defender of Islam against all threats. This religious authority was crucial. It meant that Muslims throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East looked to Baibars and the Mamluk Sultanate for leadership and protection. Religious scholars and leaders recognized Mamluk authority as legitimate and necessary. Over the next 2 decades, Baibars transformed Egypt from a country on the brink of conquest into a regional superpower. He built a navy to challenge Mongol and Crusader naval power in the Mediterranean. He established trade monopolies on goods flowing between Asia, Africa, and Europe. He invested the wealth of Egypt into military technology and training. Baibars also expanded Mamluk territory through military conquest. He drove back the Mongols in several campaigns, preventing them from advancing further into Syria. He defeated the last of the Crusader states in the Levant, capturing Antioch and eventually clearing the coastal territories of Christian kingdoms. By the time of his death in 1279, Baibars had transformed the Mamluk Sultanate into the dominant power in the Islamic world. But perhaps most importantly, Baibars established institutional structures that would ensure Mamluk power persisted long after his death. He reformed the Mamluk military system, ensuring that it remained professional, well-trained, and loyal. He established bureaucratic procedures for governance. He created legal frameworks that would guide Mamluk rule. These institutional innovations meant that the Mamluk Sultanate would not depend on a single leader. Even after Baibars died, the system he created would continue to function. The Mamluks would rule Egypt and the Levant for over 2 centuries, until Ottoman conquest in 1517. For 200 years, the Mamluks remained a major power in the Mediterranean and Middle East. This longevity is remarkable when compared to other military powers of the medieval world. The Mongol Khans saw their power fragment and decline within a century. The Crusader kingdoms fell to repeated Islamic offensives. But the Mamluks, built on foundations that Baibars established, persisted and prospered. The transformation was complete. A military order that had been created as slave soldiers had evolved into a sophisticated state apparatus. An institution based on military excellence had become a lasting civilization. Baibars had not only defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut. He had created a system that would ensure Islamic independence and prosperity for centuries to come. The significance of Ain Jalut extended far beyond the Islamic world and Egypt. The battle and its consequences reverberated across continents, influencing the development of multiple civilizations and fundamentally altering the trajectory of world history. In Europe, the news of Mamluk victory against the Mongols was received with a mixture of shock and cautious optimism. European kingdoms, particularly those in Central Europe and the Mediterranean, had lived in fear of Mongol conquest for decades. The Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe in 1237 to 1241 had devastated Polish, Hungarian, and Russian territories. Europeans had watched with horror as an Eastern power had nearly conquered their continent. Now, news arrived that an Islamic power had defeated a major Mongol force. This suggested that the Mongol threat, while formidable, was not inevitably victorious. European military strategists began to reconsider their defensive strategies. If the Mamluks could defeat Mongols through superior tactics and preparation, perhaps Europe could do likewise. In China, the victory at Ain Jalut had different implications. Kublai Khan was consolidating his power as the unquestioned ruler of the Mongol Empire. The fragmentation that would later occur had not yet begun. But the defeat of Hulagu in the west demonstrated that even Mongol forces could face serious opposition. Kublai's focus increasingly turned toward perfecting his control over China and establishing the Yuan dynasty, rather than pursuing further western expansion. In Central Asia and Russia, the Golden Horde Mongols continued to dominate, but the aura of inevitable conquest had been diminished. Russian principalities and Central Asian states began to develop strategies of resistance rather than pure accommodation. The knowledge that Mongols could be defeated, even if the opportunity came rarely, provided hope and inspiration. In India, the Delhi Sultanate had faced repeated Mongol invasions. The Mongols, however, had never successfully established lasting control over India, partly due to the climate, partly due to Indian military resilience, and partly due to logistical challenges. Ain Jalut provided additional encouragement to Indian rulers that Mongol conquest could be resisted. In Southeast Asia and the Far East, civilizations that had maintained independence from the Mongols saw their position strengthened by Baibar's victory. The Mongols remained a threat, but no longer seemed unstoppable. Kingdoms in Vietnam, Thailand, and Japan could now pursue policies of resistance with greater confidence. Even within the Mongol Empire itself, the implications were profound. Mongol subordinates and governors throughout the empire began to assess the stability of Mongol rule. If Hulagu could be defeated, could other Mongol forces be challenged? Over the following decades, numerous rebellions and resistance movements emerged in territories under Mongol control. The long-term consequence was the acceleration of Mongol fragmentation. The unified empire that Genghis Khan had created and that his immediate successors had maintained began to break apart into separate khans, each pursuing independent policies. This fragmentation meant that no single Mongol power retained the resources to launch the kind of comprehensive conquest campaigns that had characterized the mid-13th century. For world history more broadly, Ain Jalut represented a turning point in the conflict between civilizations. The age of seemingly inevitable Eastern conquest was ending. A new period was beginning in which multiple civilizations would compete for power and dominance. The idea that one civilization could conquer and rule all others would not vanish, but the practical reality of such conquest would become increasingly difficult. Ain Jalut was not just a battle between Mamluks and Mongols. It was a statement that history was not predetermined, that the outcome of civilizational conflicts could be influenced by courage, preparation, and tactical brilliance. That power, even power that seemed absolute and inevitable, could be challenged and overcome. In this sense, Baybar's victory at Ain Jalut became a symbol not just of Islamic resistance, but of human resistance against overwhelming odds. It became an inspiration to countless military leaders and commanders in the centuries that followed. It proved that David could defeat Goliath, if he fought with sufficient courage and wisdom. Centuries passed. The Mamluk Sultanate eventually fell to Ottoman conquest in 1517. The Ottoman Empire became the dominant Islamic power for the next 4 centuries. The Mongol Empire fragmented completely, its territories absorbed into successor states or conquered by new powers. But the legacy of Ain Jalut endured. Military academies throughout the Islamic world studied the battle as a masterpiece of tactical excellence. Baybar's strategies were analyzed, debated, and taught to new generations of commanders. The principles that Baybars had applied, understanding the enemy, preparing the battlefield, using terrain effectively, striking at the moment of maximum advantage, became foundational principles of military science. In Europe, as the Renaissance emerged and military theorists began to systematize the study of war, they frequently referenced Ain Jalut as an example of superior tactics overcoming superior force. They studied how Baybars had positioned his cavalry, how he had used the terrain, how he had coordinated his attacks. The battle also took on symbolic significance in Islamic culture. It became a reference point for Islamic resistance and resilience. When Islamic kingdoms faced European crusaders or other external threats, they would invoke the memory of Baybars and Ain Jalut as an inspiration. The battle represented the moment when Islamic civilization had stood against an existential threat and emerged victorious. For historians and scholars, Ain Jalut became recognized as one of the most consequential battles in world history. While battles like Hastings or Tours were fought for control of specific territories, Ain Jalut was fought for the survival of civilizations. The consequences of Mamluk victory extended across continents and influenced the development of multiple civilizations for centuries to come. Modern military theorists recognize Ain Jalut as a demonstration of how a militarily inferior force can defeat a superior one through superior preparation and tactics. The battle is studied in military academies around the world as an example of the principle that victory is not determined solely by numbers or raw military power, but by strategy, discipline, and leadership. But perhaps the deepest legacy of Ain Jalut lies in what it proved about history itself. The battle demonstrated that the future is not predetermined, that even seemingly inevitable trajectories can be altered by courage and wisdom, that individual decisions by individual leaders can change the course of civilizations. Baybars understood this. He understood that by defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut, he was not just winning a battle or even preserving an empire. He was proving that history could be changed, that the arc of human civilization was not determined by abstract forces or abstract laws, but by the choices and actions of specific individuals and peoples. This understanding informed everything Baybars did after Ain Jalut. He worked tirelessly to consolidate Mamluk power, to strengthen Islamic institutions, to ensure that the victory would endure. He understood that his triumph in 1260 could easily become a footnote in history if he did not build lasting structures upon that foundation. And he succeeded. For over 2 centuries after his death, the Mamluk Sultanate remained a major power. For over 7 centuries after Ain Jalut, the battle remained a reference point in military history and Islamic civilization. The consequences of that single day's fighting continue to echo through history even to the present day. In the end, Ain Jalut reminds us that history is made by human choices. That power, no matter how overwhelming, can be overcome by courage and wisdom. That individuals matter. that the decisions we make today can shape civilizations for centuries to come. Baibars made that choice in 1260. He chose to fight rather than flee. He chose to prepare rather than accept defeat as inevitable. And through that choice, he changed the world. We have now come full circle. From the moment Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in 1206, creating a war machine that would conquer half the known world, to the moment when that machine was stopped in a narrow valley in Palestine. From the rise of Mongol dominance to the first great setback of Mongol arms. From the age of seemingly inevitable conquest to an age where civilization could resist and endure. The story of Ain Jalut is ultimately a story about power and its limits. For over a century, the Mongols had wielded power in ways that seemed almost supernatural. They had conquered territories that seemed unconquerable. They had defeated armies that seemed undefeatable. They had inspired terror and awe throughout the world. This power had seemed unlimited, infinite, permanent. But it was not. No power is infinite. No dominance is permanent. No civilization is invincible. Baibars understood this truth. And in understanding it, he found the key to defeating the seemingly undefeatable. The Mongols had relied on psychological dominance as much as military superiority. When enemies believed they could not win, when they surrendered before battles even began, Mongol conquest was swift and easy. But when an enemy stood firm, when they believed victory was possible, the contest became much more difficult. Baibars believed victory was possible. He studied Mongol tactics not from a sense of despair, but from a sense of purpose. He learned their methods not to surrender to them, but to counter them. He prepared not because he was resigned to defeat, but because he believed that preparation and courage could overcome even the most formidable enemy. In doing so, he proved something fundamental about human civilization. He proved that we are not slaves to historical inevitability, that the future can be changed by the choices we make today, that courage, wisdom, and preparation can overcome even seemingly overwhelming odds. The implications of this truth extend far beyond the specific battle of Ain Jalut. Throughout history, countless civilizations and peoples have faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. The question they face is the same question that Baibars faced in 1260. Do we surrender to the inevitable, or do we fight? Baibars chose to fight. And in fighting, he changed not just the fate of Egypt and the Islamic world, but the fate of world civilization itself. He proved that resistance was possible, that the future was not determined, that human choice and human courage mattered. This is why Ain Jalut remains relevant 760 years later. Not because it was a particularly large battle or because it involved famous historical figures, but because it represents a fundamental truth about human civilization, that we have the power to shape our own futures. In 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, one man and his army stood against seemingly insurmountable odds. They fought with courage and wisdom. They prevailed against an enemy that had never been defeated. And in prevailing, they changed history. This is the story of Genghis Khan's horde meeting its greatest enemy. It is a story about power and its limits. It is a story about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story about how individual choices can change civilizations. But most importantly, it is a story about the eternal human capacity to resist, to overcome, to shape our own destinies, to prove that even the greatest power can be challenged. Even the mightiest fortress can be breached. Even the most certain future can be altered by courage, wisdom, and determination. This is the legacy of Ain Jalut. And this is why it will be remembered as long as humans study history and seek to understand the forces that have shaped our world. The story is ended, but the lessons endure.